Dr. Laura Hayes had never enjoyed working with physicists. They were arrogant, single-minded, and obsessed with mathematical models that often had no grounding in biological reality. But today, as she stepped into the research laboratory aboard the ISS Oppenheimer, she braced herself for a challenge unlike any other, working with an alien physicist. Kaelrith of the Adrathi was a towering, sinewy being of deep obsidian skin, his form laced with faintly glowing bioluminescent veins that pulsed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. His four eyes, a striking shade of violet, regarded Laura with an intensity that made her uneasy. "So," she said, forcing a professional tone, "you're the one they brought in to fix my research?" Kaelrith tilted his head in a distinctly inhuman gesture. "Correct," he replied. His voice was smooth, melodious, yet held an edge of condescension. "Your models for xenobiotic adaptation are incomplete. Your assumptions about non-carbon-based life forms are primitive." Laura clenched her jaw. "That's because we've only had 3 recorded encounters with true silicon-based organisms, and none of them survived long enough for proper study." Kaelrith's bioluminescence flickered briefly, a gesture she'd learned meant mild amusement. "And yet, you extrapolate universal principles from an insufficient data set. Fascinating." Laura exhaled sharply. "Listen, Professor, I don't need a physics lecture. I need to understand how these organisms function in alien atmospheres. You're supposed to help with that, not belittle my work." Kaelrith made a low, rumbling sound, perhaps the Adrathi equivalent of a chuckle. "I believe that is my purpose here. Your methods are inefficient. You rely on experimentation instead of prediction, and your methods ignore reality in favor of theoretical constructs," she snapped. For a long moment, the two stared at each other across the sterile, luminescent lab, the air between them charged with tension. Finally, Kaelrith turned away, the glow along his spine dimming slightly. "This will be an interesting collaboration," he mused. Laura sighed, rubbing her temples. "Yeah, interesting. That's one word for it." For weeks, their clashes continued. Every meeting was a battlefield, every discussion a war of methodologies. Yet, Laura had to admit, grudgingly, that Kaelrith's equations were elegant, even if they didn't always align with biological principles. And Kaelrith, despite his dismissive attitude toward experimental trial and error, found himself surprised at how much could be learned by observing rather than simply calculating. But then, the accident happened. It started with a minor data inconsistency in one of Laura's lab-grown xenobiotic cultures, a silicon-based microorganism harvested from an asteroid fragment near Proxima Centauri. At first, it seemed like a simple mutation, a natural variation. Then the containment alarms blared. Laura and Kaelrith barely had time to react before the lab's environmental seals engaged, trapping them inside with the anomaly. The microorganism, previously inert in its stasis chamber, had begun growing. Its structure expanded at an impossible rate, forming crystalline lattices that pulsed with an eerie, inner light. The stasis chamber cracked, then shattered. "What the hell?" Laura shouted, scrambling for emergency protocols. Kaelrith was already moving, his bioluminescence flaring in urgent patterns. "Your calculations underestimated the quantum instability of the sample. The radiation exposure triggered rapid phase shifting." Laura swore under her breath. "You said my calculations? You signed off on them, too." "No time for blame," Kaelrith replied sharply. "Containment must be re-established immediately." The crystalline entity surged forward, its fractal tendrils reaching for them. The air shimmered as the temperature in the lab plummeted. "Move!" Kaelrith lunged, seizing Laura and pulling her behind a reinforced workstation as the entity lashed out. A sickening crack split the air. The workstation's metal surface instantly froze under the creature's touch, brittle and fragile. Laura's pulse pounded. "It's leaching thermal energy." Kaelrith nodded, his expression grim. "And at this rate, it will spread beyond the lab within minutes." They locked eyes. For the first time since meeting, there was no argument, no competition, only a desperate, shared understanding. If they didn't stop this thing together, they were both dead. With seconds to spare, Laura and Kaelrith worked frantically. Laura synthesized an emergency stasis formula, mixing compounds by instinct, using every bit of biological knowledge she had. Kaelrith recalculated energy dispersal, aligning quantum interference patterns to neutralize the entity's aggressive expansion. Their hands brushed as they synchronized their tasks, just a fleeting contact, but enough to send an odd, electric sensation through Laura's skin. She ignored it, focusing on the crisis at hand. Then, as Kaelrith executed his final calculation, the lab was bathed in a pulse of violet-blue energy. The crystalline entity shuddered, its fractal tendrils collapsing inward, folding upon themselves until... Silence. Laura exhaled shakily, leaning against the workstation. That was way too close. Kaelrith studied the dormant crystal, his bioluminescence pulsing in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. Your solution was unexpectedly effective. Laura arched an eyebrow. Unexpectedly? Kaelrith met her gaze, and for once, there was no condescension in his voice, only something quieter. Impressive, he admitted. Laura blinked. Then, to her own surprise, she laughed. Kaelrith tilted his head. Have I said something amusing? No, it's just, she shook her head. I never thought I'd hear you say that. His eyes softened, just slightly, and I never thought I would mean it. They stood there for a moment, caught between exhaustion and something unspoken, something new. Neither of them knew it yet, but the real discovery wasn't in the crystalline anomaly. It was in each other. The emergency response team arrived 4 minutes after Laura and Kaelrith neutralized the anomaly, 4 minutes too late to be of any real help. They found the lab in shambles, temperature readings wildly unstable, and 2 exhausted scientists sitting side by side on the floor, staring at the inert crystalline mass that had nearly killed them. Dr. Elias Morgan, the station's chief administrator, stormed into the lab, his face flushed red with anger. What the hell happened here? Laura groaned and rubbed her temples. You could start with, "Are you okay?" Kaelrith, still eerily composed, gestured toward the containment breach. Dr. Hayes' experimental sample entered an accelerated quantum state, a reaction to unforeseen variables in its surrounding environment. Elias narrowed his eyes. And whose fault was that? Laura and Kaelrith both opened their mouths, then hesitated. For once, neither of them wanted to throw the other under the proverbial bus. Joint miscalculation, Kaelrith finally said, his voice calm. But ultimately, joint resolution? Elias crossed his arms. So you're telling me you nearly destroyed my station, and now you expect me to be grateful that you fixed the disaster you caused? Laura sighed. Look, Elias, we learned something huge from this. The entity wasn't just growing. It was self-replicating based on a quantum phase shift we didn't anticipate. She glanced at Kaelrith, something unspoken passing between them. If we refine our models, we could actually control its properties. Kaelrith nodded. Potential applications range from advanced energy storage to adaptive shielding technology. Elias pinched the bridge of his nose. Great. So in other words, you two almost killed yourselves, but now you want me to approve more experiments with this thing? Laura smirked. That is what you pay us for. Elias exhaled sharply, glaring at both of them before muttering, I'm going to regret this, and storming out of the lab. Laura turned to Kaelrith. Well, that could have gone worse. Kaelrith regarded her for a moment, his bioluminescence pulsing in a slow, thoughtful rhythm. You are remarkably unconcerned with authority. Laura grinned. That a problem? A pause. Then, to her surprise, Kaelrith's glow pulsed brighter. Amusement. No, he said. It is fascinating. She snorted. Careful. You keep saying things like that, and I might start thinking you actually like working with me. Kaelrith tilted his head. An interesting hypothesis. And for once, Laura found herself at a loss for words. The following days were quieter. Their usual bickering had softened, shifting into something more akin to, well, conversation. Not that Laura would ever admit it, but she was beginning to enjoy working with Kaelrith. There was something about his unwavering logic, the way he meticulously worked through problems, that was oddly reassuring. And despite his initial dismissal of her methods, he had started listening, even incorporating some of her biological insights into his equations. In return, Laura found herself intrigued by his approach to physics, especially the Edrothy concept of dynamic probabilities, which treated reality itself as a shifting set of potential states. It was infuriatingly complicated, and yet, she found herself wanting to understand it. Late one night, she caught herself staring at him as he worked, his dark, obsidian-like skin illuminated by the soft glow of his bioluminescent veins. His 4 violet eyes flickered between screens, hands moving in precise, elegant gestures. It was mesmerizing, which was not something she wanted to dwell on. She forced herself to clear her throat. So, about our next experiment. Kaelrith didn't look up. The anomaly's quantum state must be stabilized before further interaction. Right. Which means we need a way to predict when it's going to shift phases again. Kaelrith finally met her gaze. An optimal approach would be to synchronize your biological analysis with my probability models. A dual-layered predictive system. Laura raised an eyebrow. Wait, my work gets equal footing now? Kaelrith's bioluminescence flickered slightly. It has proven effective. Laura grinned. I'm gonna take that as an admission that you were wrong about my methods. Kaelrith's expression remained neutral. I acknowledge partial misjudgment. Laura snorted. You are so bad at admitting defeat. Kaelrith blinked, his gaze steady. And yet, I continue to engage in discourse with you. Curious. Her breath caught for just a second, because something in the way he said that felt different, not mocking, not dismissive, just honest. She wasn't sure what to do with that. So instead, she smirked and turned back to her workstation. All right, Professor Tentacles, let's make some science happen. Kaelrith tilted his head. My species does not possess tentacles. Laura chuckled. I know, it's a joke. You gotta work on your humor. Kaelrith hummed thoughtfully. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is you who must refine your delivery. Laura opened her mouth to fire back. But then she saw the subtle flicker of his bioluminescence, and she realized. He was joking. She laughed. And for once, Kaelrith actually smiled. Laura had always believed that science could explain everything, until she started wondering why her heart raced every time Kaelrith leaned a little too close. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't even logical. It just happened. A creeping awareness of him that she couldn't shake. A strange pull that made their usual verbal sparring feel different somehow. And it was driving her crazy. They were supposed to be working. They were working. Every night. They refined their models, analyzed data from the anomaly, ran simulations. But the closer they got to a breakthrough, the more she found herself studying him instead. The subtle flickers of his bioluminescence when he was deep in thought. The way his 4 violet eyes reflected the dim light of the lab. The almost imperceptible shift in his posture whenever he was amused by her. It wasn't just attraction, it was curiosity. And that was dangerous, because the more she wanted to understand him, the more she feared what that might mean. It all came to a head one night when they were arguing, again, this time about the structural limitations of their containment field. We can't reinforce the stasis chamber using your method, Kaelrith said, his tone clipped. It disrupts the probability wave and could trigger another phase shift. Laura crossed her arms. And your method relies on calculations that don't account for the biological properties of the entity. It's not just a quantum structure. It's alive. Kaelrith exhaled sharply, his bioluminescence pulsing with irritation. Your insistence on treating this as a biological phenomenon instead of a physics problem is... He stopped abruptly, eyes narrowing at her. Laura frowned. What? You're flustered. Her stomach dropped. Excuse me? Kaelrith tilted his head, his gaze piercing. Your heart rate has increased. Your body temperature is slightly elevated. Your breathing pattern is uneven. Laura felt a hot flush rise to her face. Wow, okay. First of all, creepy. Second, maybe that's because I've been arguing with a stubborn, arrogant. You are avoiding the question, Kaelrith interrupted smoothly. Laura's mouth opened, then closed. She had nothing. Because the real answer, the one she refused to acknowledge, was that yes, she was flustered. But not because of the argument. Because of him. And somehow, he knew it. Kaelrith studied her for a long moment before his bioluminescence flickered in something close to satisfaction. He murmured, almost to himself. What? She snapped, folding her arms tighter. Kaelrith's gaze remained steady. An intriguing reaction. Laura narrowed her eyes. She stopped herself, shaking her head. You are insufferable. Kaelrith inclined his head slightly. And yet, you continue to engage with me. Laura turned on her heel and stormed out of the lab, her pulse pounding in her ears. Because, damn it, he was right. Laura needed a distraction. Unfortunately, the distraction came in the form of a mandatory social event, a diplomatic function aboard the ISS Oppenheimer to celebrate another successful year of human-Adrathi collaboration. Normally, she'd have skipped it, but Elias had cornered her in the mess hall and made it very clear that if she didn't show up, he'd reassign her to a very unpleasant logistics project. So here she was, in a dress, holding a glass of something that was probably meant to resemble champagne. And of course, Kaelrith was there. He stood at the edge of the room, as poised and unreadable as ever, watching the crowd with that unsettlingly focused gaze of his. His bioluminescent veins pulsed faintly under the dim lights, casting a soft glow over the intricate, metallic fabric of his formal Adrathi attire. And then, he was looking at her. Laura swallowed. Nope, not doing this tonight. She turned toward the buffet table, determined to distract herself with something mundane. Your behavior is unusual. She nearly dropped her drink. Kaelrith had appeared beside her with that frustratingly smooth grace of his voice low enough that only she could hear. Laura sighed. Yeah, well, maybe I just don't like forced socializing. Kaelrith studied her. You are avoiding me. She scoffed. I am not. You have deliberately reduced our conversational exchanges by 43% over the past 72 hours. Laura's eyes widened. Did you seriously calculate that? Kaelrith blinked. Yes. Oh my God. She rubbed her temples. You are actually the worst. Kaelrith tilted his head, his bioluminescence flickering in mild amusement. And yet, you continue to engage with me. Laura glared at him. You love saying that, don't you? Kaelrith considered this. It is accurate. Something in his tone, something almost warm, made her pulse stutter. She took a deep breath. Nope, not going there. But then Kaelrith did something unexpected. He leaned in, just slightly, his voice dropping even lower. You are still flustered. Laura's breath caught. She should have denied it, should have rolled her eyes, laughed it off, anything. Instead, she just stood there, staring at him, aware of how very close he was. For once, she had nothing to say. And Kaelrith, damn him, knew it. His bioluminescence pulsed softly, almost as if he were pleased. And that was when Laura knew. She was in serious trouble. The anomaly's quantum stabilization had become their obsession. Every waking hour was spent refining models, running simulations, and debating theories laid into the artificial night cycle of the ISS Oppenheimer. But despite their efforts, something was off. Their predictive system was working, most of the time, but every few cycles, the anomaly would phase shift in an unpredictable way, defying both Laura's biological analysis and Kaelrith's probability calculations. It is behaving as if it possesses agency, Kaelrith said one evening, watching the crystalline mass vibrate slightly within its containment field, as if it is reacting to our attempts to measure it. Laura frowned. That sounds dangerously close to sentience. Not sentience, Kaelrith corrected, but awareness, an adaptive response to external observation. Laura exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Okay, let's say you're right. How do we control something that reacts to being watched? Kaelrith was silent for a long moment. Then, his bioluminescence flickered in a slow, deliberate pattern. There is one possible method, he said carefully. A direct neural interface. Laura blinked. Come again? Kaelrith turned to her, his expression unreadable. If the entity is adapting to our observation, then the best way to predict its behavior would be to observe it not as an external force, but as part of its system. Laura's stomach dropped. You're suggesting direct mental synchronization? Yes. She stared at him. You do realize that's insane, right? Kaelrith tilted his head. Is it? Yes. That's how you get your brain fried. She gestured toward the anomaly. We don't even fully understand what this thing is yet. If you link your mind to it, there's no telling what it could do to you. Kaelrith remained unfazed. And yet, the data suggests that such an experiment would yield the most accurate results. Laura groaned, pacing. This is exactly why I hate physicists. You all think you're invincible. Kaelrith regarded her with quiet curiosity. I do not believe myself invincible. Then why the hell are you willing to risk your life over this? A pause. Kaelrith's bioluminescence dimmed slightly. Because it is the only way forward. Laura stopped pacing. She stared at him, really stared at him. For the first time since they had met, she saw something beyond his cold logic. A quiet determination, an acceptance of risk that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. And suddenly, she wasn't just arguing as a scientist anymore. She was arguing because she didn't want to lose him. She swallowed hard. Then let me do it. Kaelrith's expression darkened. No. Oh, so you can risk yourself, but I can't? It is not a matter of permission, Kaelrith said calmly. Your neural structure is not designed for this kind of interface. My species has experience with direct quantum synchronization. Yours does not. Laura narrowed her eyes. You don't know that. Kaelrith stepped closer. I do. They stood there, inches apart, the hum of the anomaly crackling between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Laura sighed, rubbing her forehead. Goddamn it, Kaelrith. A flicker of amusement danced across his bioluminescence. I will take that as reluctant approval. She scowled. I haven't approved anything yet. She huffed. Fine, but if you die, I'm bringing you back just to yell at you. Kaelrith's glow pulsed again, faintly. A fair arrangement. The interface chamber was dimly lit, the air heavy with anticipation. Laura double-checked the neural stabilizers, her fingers flying over the controls as Kaelrith reclined on the medical platform. His bioluminescence pulsed in slow, steady patterns. Last chance to back out, she muttered, adjusting the final settings. Kaelrith met her gaze. I will proceed. Laura swallowed. Okay, here goes nothing. She activated the link. The room dissolved. For a fraction of a second, she saw everything. Kaelrith's thoughts, his consciousness, the vast, alien complexity of his mind unfolding like 1,000 interwoven patterns of light. And then, the anomaly saw them. It wasn't just adapting. It was listening. A surge of energy lashed through the interface. Kaelrith tensed, his bioluminescence flaring violently. Laura's heart slammed against her ribs. Kaelrith? Talk to me. His voice came, strained, distorted. It is communicating. Laura's hands clenched around the controls. Pull back. You're gonna overload the link. Kaelrith's breathing was sharp, uneven. No, I must understand. The anomaly moved. Not physically, but within the space of their minds. For the first time, Laura felt it. A presence. A question. And then, the link snapped. Kaelrith gasped, lurching upright as the interface severed. Laura barely caught him before he collapsed, his body trembling, bioluminescence flickering wildly. She grabbed his shoulders. Kaelrith, hey, stay with me. His breathing slowed. His eyes, deep violet, unreadable, met hers. And then he said something that sent ice through her veins. It knows who we are. Laura's stomach twisted. What? Kaelrith's voice was quiet. It was never just reacting to us. His bioluminescence dimmed, flickering. It was waiting for us to notice it. Laura felt her pulse thunder. The anomaly wasn't just an accident of quantum instability. It was alive. And now, it was awake. The silence in the lab was suffocating. Laura felt Kaelrith's weight pressing against her as he struggled to regain his balance. His bioluminescence flickered erratically, a rhythmic stuttering she had never seen before. Her fingers tightened around his shoulders. Kaelrith, look at me. Are you you? Kaelrith exhaled sharply, his body rigid. Then, slowly, his gaze lifted to hers. I am myself, he murmured. though something about his voice felt off. He blinked, his 4 violet eyes dilating unevenly before realigning. "But I am changed." A cold shiver ran down Laura's spine. Changed how? Kaelrith was silent for a long moment. Then, with deliberate care, he raised a trembling hand and pressed his fingertips to his temple. And suddenly, she heard it. A whisper. A deep, pulsing hum that resonated not in the air, but inside her mind. You see, the voice wasn't human. It wasn't Adrathi. It wasn't anything she had ever heard before. She jerked back instinctively. Jesus! Kaelrith flinched. His bioluminescence flared, casting shifting shadows across the lab walls. Laura's breath came in short, uneven bursts. Kaelrith, what the hell was that? Kaelrith's expression was unreadable. "It is the anomaly," he said softly. "It has made contact." Laura stared at him. "And it's talking to us?" Kaelrith's fingers curled against his palm. "Not in words. In concepts. It exists in a state beyond linear thought. It does not speak as we do." He hesitated, his voice quieter now. "But it knows us." Laura swallowed hard. "And what does it want?" Kaelrith's eyes darkened. "I do not yet know." The next few days were unsettling. Kaelrith recovered quickly from the neural link, but something about him had shifted. His movements were a fraction slower, his speech more deliberate. And then there were the glitches. Small things at first, Kaelrith pausing mid-sentence, as if distracted by something no one else could hear. The way his bioluminescence would pulse in strange, irregular patterns, like a radio picking up interference. And always, there was that feeling of being watched. Laura tried to bury herself in work, focusing on the data, the science, anything but the gnawing sensation in her gut. But the truth was, she wasn't sleeping much, because every time she closed her eyes, she heard the whisper. You see, it wasn't just in her head anymore. It was in Kaelrith's too. They were connected now, whether they wanted to be or not. And the anomaly was waiting. "Kaelrith, you need to let me run a neural scan." Laura stood with her arms crossed, blocking his path. She had never been able to physically stop Kaelrith from doing anything before. He was a full foot taller than her, his physiology vastly stronger than a human's. But right now, he wasn't at his best. And they both knew it. Kaelrith's bioluminescence pulsed dimly. "A scan will reveal nothing conclusive." Laura scoffed. "You don't know that." Kaelrith tilted his head. "I do, because I have already begun, perceiving beyond what a scan can measure." Her stomach tightened. "What the hell does that mean?" Kaelrith was silent for a long time. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I can see the anomaly's probability shifts without measuring them." Laura's breath hitched. "That's impossible." Kaelrith met her gaze. "And yet," a long pause. Laura took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Kaelrith, this isn't just quantum synchronization anymore. This is," she exhaled shakily, "it's changing you." Kaelrith's expression didn't shift, but for the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. Something human. Fear. "I know," he murmured. Laura swallowed hard. "Then we need to stop before it." The lights in the lab flickered. Laura's words died in her throat. For a split second, the entire room seemed to stretch, distort, bend. And then, Kaelrith vanished. Laura's heart slammed against her ribs. Kaelrith? Silence. The anomaly pulsed within its containment field, its crystalline form shimmering in a way she had never seen before. Something had changed. Laura's fingers flew over the console. Come on, she forced herself to focus. Kaelrith hadn't just disappeared. He was still somewhere. The quantum stabilization readings were spiking erratically. The energy fluctuations were forming patterns, complex, layered, like a signal that had just taken him. Then, suddenly, a sound, a deep, resonant hum, vibrating through the station's walls. The anomaly flared, its crystalline form shifting, unfolding like an impossible geometry made of light. And then, Kaelrith reappeared. Laura staggered backward, her breath caught in her throat. He stood in the center of the lab, his posture rigid, His bioluminescence was brighter than she had ever seen before, his entire body flickering like a pulsar. And his 4 violet eyes were no longer violet. They were black. The whisper came again, this time not in her head, this time from Kaelrith's lips. "We see you now." Laura's blood ran cold. Whatever had just happened, Kaelrith wasn't alone anymore. Something had come back with him. Laura had seen Kaelrith injured before. She had seen him exhausted, frustrated, even, though he'd never admit it, afraid. But this was different. He stood motionless, his bioluminescence flickering in rapid, erratic bursts. The glow along his obsidian-like skin pulsed out of sync with his normal rhythm, shifting unpredictably, like a machine struggling to reboot. And his eyes, black, endless voids where violet should have been, made her stomach twist with something dangerously close to dread. She took a cautious step forward. "Kaelrith?" His gaze snapped to her. The whisper came again, this time from his own throat. "We see you now." Laura's breath hitched. "Who's we?" Kaelrith blinked once, then again. Then, with a slow inhale, the blackness faded from his eyes, retracting like ink seeping away into invisible cracks. His violet irises returned, sharp and alert, but wrong. Because when he spoke again, his voice was layered. His voice, but something beneath it, a resonance that didn't belong to anything human or Adrathi. "Laura?" Her stomach clenched. "Yeah," she said carefully. "It's me." "You with me, Professor?" Kaelrith lifted a hand, staring at his own fingers as if they were unfamiliar to him. The glow along his veins fluctuated, his body visibly trying to reassert control. "I am myself," he murmured. Then quieter. "But not only myself." Laura's pulse pounded. "What the hell does that mean?" Kaelrith's gaze lifted to meet hers, and for the first time, there was something vulnerable in his expression. "The anomaly did not merely observe me," he said. "It touched me." A pause. Then, his voice barely above a whisper. "And now, it is inside my mind." Kaelrith remained under strict observation for the next 72 hours. Laura refused to leave his side. Not that Elias Morgan was particularly thrilled about that. "You should be quarantined too, you know," he grumbled, arms crossed as he stood outside the sealed observation chamber. "Whatever the hell this thing did to him, we don't know if it's contagious." Laura shot him a glare through the reinforced glass. "If it were contagious, I'd already have it. And unless you have another expert on Adrathi neural structures lying around, I'm not leaving him alone in there." Elias exhaled sharply. "You're too close to this, Laura." "No," she said. "I'm just the only one who actually gives a damn about him." She regretted saying it immediately, but it was true. Elias sighed. "Fine. But if he shows any sign of turning into an alien horror, I'm venting that room into space." Laura clenched her jaw. "You won't have to." Elias gave her a long, unreadable look, then turned and walked away. She took a steadying breath before stepping inside. Kaelrith was seated on the medical platform, his posture composed, but Laura could see the tension in him. His fingers twitched slightly at his sides, and his bioluminescence still pulsed with subtle, irregular flickers. She pulled up a chair and sat across from him. "How are you feeling?" Kaelrith hesitated. "Change." Laura studied him. "Define change." A pause. Then, Kaelrith reached for the table beside him, and without touching it, the metal rippled. Laura's breath caught. "Kaelrith." He withdrew his hand immediately, his expression unreadable. "I did not intend to do that." Laura forced herself to stay calm. "What exactly did you just do?" Kaelrith exhaled. "I do not know. It is as if my perception of matter has shifted. When I focus on an object, I can sense its molecular structure. And in some way, I can influence it." Laura's mind raced. This was way beyond quantum synchronization. This was something else entirely. She swallowed. "Okay, that's definitely new." Kaelrith's gaze met hers. "And there is more." Laura tensed. "More?" Kaelrith hesitated. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he reached out, fingertips barely brushing her wrist. The moment they touched, A shockwave of sensation surged through her mind. Memories, not hers, flooded into her thoughts in a violent cascade. Flashes of light. A sky that was not a sky, unfolding in fractal patterns beyond comprehension. An awareness pressing against her consciousness, something vast, endless, watching. Then, just as suddenly, it was gone. Laura gasped, jerking back. Her heart slammed against her ribs. What the hell was that? Kaelrith's bioluminescence flickered. You saw it, did you not? Laura pressed a trembling hand to her forehead. I don't even know what I saw. Kaelrith's voice was quieter now. You saw what it sees. A cold weight settled in Laura's chest. The anomaly wasn't just inside Kaelrith's mind. It was linked to hers now, too. For days, Laura and Kaelrith tested the limits of his new abilities. The results were unsettling. His perception had changed in ways no human, or Adrathi, had ever experienced. He could sense energy fields, anticipate shifts in quantum states without measuring them, and manipulate molecular structures through mere focus. And worst of all, Laura was starting to feel it too. At first, it was subtle, an ability to sense Kaelrith's presence even when she wasn't looking at him. Then, strange moments of intuition, knowing what he was about to say before he spoke it. And at night, when she closed her eyes, she saw glimpses of something beyond her comprehension. The same endless fractal sky. The same whispering presence at the edge of her thoughts. We see you now. She didn't tell Elias. She couldn't. Because deep down, she already knew the truth. They weren't just studying the anomaly anymore. They were becoming part of it. And the real question wasn't how it had changed them. It was why. Laura Hayes had always believed that science had answers. That every question, no matter how strange or terrifying, could be unraveled with enough research, enough data. But now, sitting across from Kaelrith in the dim light of the ISS Oppenheimer's lab, she knew she had been wrong. Some things weren't meant to be understood. Some things changed you before you could even ask the right questions. Kaelrith was different now, and so was she. His bioluminescence no longer flickered with uncertainty. It moved in deliberate, rhythmic pulses, shifting in patterns she had begun to understand without knowing how. His violet eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before, as if he was looking at two realities at once. And Laura, God, she could feel him, even when they weren't touching. Even when he was across the room, she could sense his presence like a pulse beneath her skin, like they were no longer separate, like the anomaly had rewritten them both. She exhaled slowly, pressing her fingers against the smooth surface of the lab table. So, her voice came out steadier than she expected. Are we even still us? Kaelrith regarded her for a long moment. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, I ask myself the same question. A pause. Then Laura let out a shaky laugh. That's not reassuring, Professor. His bioluminescence flickered. Amusement. Would you prefer a comforting lie? She smirked. Maybe. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was different, as if words were no longer their only way of communicating. And maybe they weren't, because when Kaelrith finally spoke, she already knew what he was going to say. There is no undoing this, he murmured. We are altered. Permanently. Laura exhaled. Yeah, I figured. She tapped her fingers absently against the table, trying to ignore the way her skin still tingled from where he had touched her, trying to ignore the way her mind felt too open, too aware. For the first time, she wasn't afraid. She was curious. What if we don't fight it? She asked softly. Kaelrith tilted his head. You would embrace this transformation? She met his gaze. I don't think we have a choice. Kaelrith studied her, something unreadable in his expression. Then, with deliberate care, he reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. The moment their fingers brushed, reality shifted. The walls of the lab seemed to stretch, expand, unfold. Not physically, but in a way that defied human perception. Laura gasped, her breath catching in her throat. For a fleeting moment, she saw it. The true shape of the anomaly. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't a mere quantum instability. It was alive. And it had never been waiting for them. It had been guiding them. A voice, not words, but understanding, whispered through her mind. Step forward. Kaelrith's grip on her hand tightened. His eyes met hers, and for once, there was no scientific detachment, no barriers of species or logic or doubt. Just them. Two minds, two beings, standing at the edge of something vast and impossible. Laura swallowed hard. You ready for this? Kaelrith's bioluminescence pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. With you? Always. And together, hand in hand, they stepped into the unknown. The ISS Oppenheimer sent out a distress signal when Dr. Laura Hayes and Kaelrith vanished. Search teams scoured the station, analyzing every piece of data, replaying security footage over and over again. But no one could explain what had happened. The anomaly was gone. The containment chamber was empty. There was no trace of either scientist. For months, the station remained on high alert, fearing another quantum event. Then, one day, the anomaly returned. Not as a threat, not as an accident, but as them. Laura and Kaelrith reappeared in the same lab they had vanished from, standing side by side, untouched by time. Their eyes glowed with a light not entirely their own. Their bodies, once separate, now moved in perfect synchronicity. They were still themselves, but they were more. And when they spoke, it was in unison. We have seen beyond the boundary, they said. And now, we bring the knowledge back. The universe had changed them. Now, it was their turn to change the universe.